James Harper had everything: power, wealth, control, until a 6-year-old boy walked into his office, asked for a job, and shattered the world he thought was complete. The morning had started like any other for James Harper. He arrived at the sleek glass headquarters of Harper Hospitality Group just before 7, his signature gray suit pressed to perfection, shoes gleaming, and tie knotted with practiced precision. The 28th floor office was quiet as usual, the early hour allowing him a few moments of solitude before the chaos of meetings and calls began. He sat at his desk, a massive slab of walnut positioned beneath towering windows that overlooked the city skyline, and began reviewing the quarterly performance reports for his restaurants. His empire, built over decades, spanned more than 60 locations across the country, each one a refined machine of hospitality, precision, and luxury. He was known for excellence, discipline, and an uncompromising drive. He had no time for surprises. But that day, one would find him anyway. The knock was soft. Not the firm, double tap of his assistant or the confident stride of an executive. It was hesitant. Almost uncertain. James frowned and looked up. His assistant hadn't announced anyone. He pressed the intercom, but before he could speak, the knock came again, slightly louder this time. Puzzled, he rose from his desk and crossed the office. When he opened the door, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. A boy, maybe 6 years old, maybe younger, stood alone in the hallway. He had short, messy brown hair and eyes that were an almost startling shade of blue. He wore a faded blue t-shirt several sizes too big and a pair of worn black jeans. His sneakers were scuffed and untied. His face was smudged with dirt, but his expression was fierce, determined. He looked straight up at James and said, without hesitation, "Give me a job." James blinked, caught off guard. He looked around, expecting a parent or guardian to appear from around the corner. But no one came. "A job?" James repeated slowly. "You're very young. Why would you need a job?" The boy squared his shoulders, lifting his chin. "Because I'm hungry." For a moment, James didn't speak. He had conducted interviews with Michelin-starred chefs, fired executives with more degrees than most universities could award, but never had he been confronted by a child asking for employment in his corporate office. And never with such quiet desperation. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "Lucas," the boy replied. "Lucas Brady." "Where are your parents, Lucas?" The boy looked away, his mouth tightening into a firm line. "My mom died. I don't have a dad." James stood, instinctively glancing down the hallway again. Still no one. No guardian. No social worker. Just this small boy standing in the heart of a billion-dollar company asking for work in exchange for food. There was something in the boy's voice that struck James hard. It wasn't just sadness, it was resilience, the kind of hardened tone James recognized because he had once heard it in his own voice, decades ago, when he was a boy begging shopkeepers for spare bread while his mother worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. He tapped the intercom. "Vanessa, cancel my next meeting." Then he stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in, Lucas." The boy hesitated only briefly before walking inside. He didn't look around in awe at the size of the office or the floor-to-ceiling windows or the glass table that had hosted world-renowned chefs and investors. Instead, he walked straight to the chair in front of James's desk and sat down, his feet not even touching the floor. He sat up straight and looked James dead in the eye. James sat across from him, laced his fingers together, and tried to remain composed. "You said you're hungry. When was the last time you ate?" Lucas thought for a moment. "Yesterday morning. A lady in a cafe gave me toast." "And you came here, why?" The boy shrugged, but the gesture was loaded. "My mom used to say my dad worked in restaurants. That he was a boss. When I saw your sign outside, I thought maybe it was you." James froze. He stared at the boy, really looked at him this time. The eyes. The chin. Something about the way he spoke, measured, brave, but hiding something broken beneath. Something clicked deep inside James's memory, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he said softly, "Well, Lucas, you're in the right place for food." He stood and walked to the small kitchenette in the corner of his office. Minutes later, he returned with a warm croissant and a bottle of water. Lucas took them politely, but didn't devour the food like James had expected. He ate slowly, carefully, as if he didn't know when the next meal would come, and he had to make this one last. James watched him, his chest tightening. He didn't know who this boy truly was, not yet. But one thing was already clear: Lucas Brady wasn't just another child in need. He was here for a reason. And James, whether he was ready or not, had just opened the door to something far greater than a simple act of kindness. James didn't know what to make of the boy sitting across from him, quietly finishing the last bite of a croissant with the care of someone who had learned to appreciate every crumb. Lucas hadn't fidgeted or spoken much after that initial request. He didn't look frightened, and he wasn't trying to charm or manipulate. There was a calmness to him that James found both disarming and deeply unsettling. No 6-year-old should carry themselves like that, like someone who had already figured out the world couldn't be trusted to take care of him. Once Lucas finished eating, he gently folded the napkin and placed it on the edge of the desk, then looked up with those sharp, pale blue eyes and said, "Thank you." James leaned back in his chair, studying the boy with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Lucas," he said carefully, "how exactly did you get here? Did someone bring you?" Lucas shook his head. "No. I walked." "From where?" Lucas hesitated for the first time. He looked down at his shoes and pressed his lips together. "I don't know the name. But it's a place where they keep kids. They told me I couldn't leave. But I left anyway." James blinked. "You mean a foster home?" Lucas shook his head again. "A place with a fence and rules. They said I had to stay until someone picked me. But no one ever picked me. So I left." His tone was too steady. That was what struck James the most. He wasn't telling a dramatic story to get sympathy, he was simply stating facts, like a child who had accepted too much far too soon. James exhaled slowly. His mind was already racing. He didn't know yet if this boy was his son, or just a stranger with an extraordinary sense of direction and a desperate story. But either way, something about this moment felt significant. He stood up and walked toward the window, staring out at the skyline while trying to clear his thoughts. Then he turned back to Lucas. "You said your mom told you your dad worked in restaurants." Lucas nodded. "Did she ever say his name?" Lucas shrugged. "She said he was a good cook. That he had dark hair. That he made people listen when he talked. But she never said his name. Just that he used to own kitchens. That he disappeared." James sat back down and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. He didn't remember every name or face from those early years, especially the women who had come and gone while he was working 16-hour days building his first 2 restaurants. But he had a vague, flickering memory of a hostess named Emma. Sweet. Quiet. She had worked at one of his kitchens for a short time. She left suddenly. No explanation. No call. He hadn't thought about her in years. He pressed the intercom button. "Vanessa, I need you to cancel everything for the rest of the day and send Mr. Kane in here immediately." Lucas blinked at the sudden command but didn't flinch. He just sat quietly, watching. When Kane entered the office a few minutes later, James stood. "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Emma Brady. She worked for us about 7 years ago, maybe more. She may have lived in Queens. She had a child, his name is Lucas. He's sitting in front of me now. Kane's eyes widened only slightly before he nodded. "I'll get on it right away." As Kane left, James sat back down. He looked at Lucas, really looked, and saw now the traces of familiarity he had been too distracted to notice earlier. The eyes, yes. The shape of his nose. Even the posture. James had always had a quiet strength in his shoulders that people misread as arrogance. Lucas carried himself the same way. "You said your mom died," James said gently. Lucas nodded. "In a car crash. A man in a uniform told me. He said she didn't wake up." James swallowed hard. "And after that, they sent you to the place with the fence?" Lucas nodded again. "I waited there. I thought maybe someone would come for me. But no one did." James sat back, silent for a long time. He wasn't used to moments like this. He wasn't used to decisions that weren't calculated and clean. But there was nothing clean about this. It was messy, uncertain, and undeniably human. This boy had walked into his life carrying 1,000 unspoken burdens, and James couldn't walk away. Not again. Not like before. "Lucas," he said after a long pause, "do you want to stay here for a little while? Just until we figure things out?" The boy looked up, and for the first time, his expression softened. "Do I get to help in the kitchen?" James smiled, the first real smile he had felt in weeks. "We'll see what we can do." And in that moment, something inside him, something long dormant and tightly locked away, began to wake up. James didn't sleep much that night. Even in the comfort of his penthouse, surrounded by polished surfaces and a skyline view most people only saw in movies, his mind wouldn't settle. He kept seeing Lucas's face, those clear blue eyes filled with something that looked too much like quiet survival. He sat for hours in his home office with a glass of water in hand, staring at an old photo on the bookshelf of himself as a boy with his mother. She had been young, tired, wearing a diner uniform, but her arm was wrapped tightly around his small shoulders. They had nothing back then, not even security, but she had given him everything she could. He thought of what she would say now, if she could see him, wealthy, respected, powerful. And yet, none of that had helped a 6-year-old boy standing in his office asking for food. In the morning, Kane called with an update. James answered on the first ring. "Her name was Emma Brady," Kane said. "She worked at your Midtown location for about 8 months, almost exactly 7 years ago. She left suddenly, no warning. She didn't give a reason. There was no record of her reapplying, and she didn't list any emergency contacts. From what I could dig up, she moved around a lot after that. Several part-time jobs, mostly waitressing. No known relatives. She died in a car crash 6 weeks ago on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. She was alone. The child, Lucas, was placed into the foster system the same day. He stayed in temporary housing in a group facility in the Bronx. He escaped 4 days ago." James closed his eyes, pressing his thumb to the bridge of his nose. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Do we have confirmation he's hers?" "Yes," Kane said. "And James, the timelines match. She gave birth about 6.5 years ago. It's highly probable you're the father." James didn't answer for a long moment. He just nodded into the silence, then ended the call. There was no part of him that doubted the truth anymore. He remembered Emma's face now. The quiet strength in her eyes. The way she'd blush when she laughed. They had only spent a few weeks together, but she had left an impression, one he'd buried beneath the chaos of ambition. And now, from that forgotten chapter, came a child. His child. He drove to the office that day with his chest heavy and his thoughts spinning. Lucas was already there, sitting in the break room with a warm bowl of oatmeal and a juice box that Vanessa had kindly arranged. The boy looked up as James entered, not with fear or hope, but with that same patient curiosity. "Hi," he said, simple as always. James sat beside him, not bothering with pretense. "I found out more about your mom," he said. "She worked for me once. A long time ago. I didn't know about you, Lucas. If I had, things would have been different." Lucas didn't say anything. He just stared into his oatmeal, his spoon idle. James hesitated, then continued. "You were really brave to come find me." Still no reply. Then, softly, Lucas said, "She used to say I had your eyes. I didn't believe her. But now I think maybe I do." James smiled faintly, surprised by the emotion that caught in his throat. "You do," he said. "Exactly like mine." For the rest of the day, James kept Lucas close. He cancelled meetings and asked Vanessa to notify legal about the possibility of guardianship procedures. He didn't want to waste a second. That afternoon, he took Lucas on a quiet tour of one of the restaurant kitchens, not the glamorous flagship, but the original Harper Bistro on 14th Street, the place where it all began. Lucas walked through the narrow back halls and prep lines like he was entering a palace. He asked questions, touched everything with reverence, and lit up when a cook showed him how to hold a whisk. James stood at a distance for a while, just watching. He saw the boy not as a stranger, not even as a responsibility, but as a living reflection of everything he had once wanted to become and everything he had almost forgotten to be. Somewhere between the pans and the smell of garlic and steam, James felt something in him soften. When they returned to the office later that evening, Lucas curled up on the sofa in James's private lounge and fell asleep mid-sentence, a children's cookbook still open in his lap. James sat nearby, the lights dimmed, paperwork untouched, and realized he had never felt the weight of responsibility like this before. Not in boardrooms, not with investors, not with global expansion. This was different. This was fatherhood. He leaned back, watching the boy sleep, and whispered to no one, "You're not too small, kid. You're just in the wrong world. Let's fix that." And for the first time in years, James Harper knew exactly what his next step would be. James had spent years living in a world where decisions were made with speed, precision, and a sharp sense of cost versus reward. But nothing in his life had ever prepared him for the emotional weight of the choices he was making now. He'd spent the last 2 days arranging for Lucas to stay with him temporarily, something that required navigating a tangled web of legal procedures, emergency guardianship requests, and whispered conversations with attorneys who weren't used to hearing hesitation in his voice. It all moved slower than he wanted, and for once, James didn't have control. But he had clarity. And he had resolve. Lucas had quickly settled into a rhythm inside James's penthouse, as if he'd been born to adapt. He never demanded, never whined. He asked questions respectfully, picked up after himself, and looked both delighted and a little stunned every time he was offered something as simple as a hot breakfast or a warm blanket. James noticed how the boy checked the locks on the doors every night before bed, how he lined up his shoes neatly by the wall, how he seemed to wait for the moment someone might ask him to leave. It wasn't fear in Lucas's eyes. It was expectation, shaped by too many nights in temporary beds and too many adults who promised more than they gave. And James, watching it all unfold, felt a sharp ache each time Lucas said, "Thank you," for something he shouldn't have to be grateful for. One evening, James sat down on the edge of the couch while Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a children's cookbook they'd found in a dusty box from one of the restaurant openings. Lucas traced his finger along the pages like he was reading scripture. "Do you think I could really make something like this one day?" he asked, his voice hushed, like the dream might disappear if spoken too loudly. James nodded. "I think you already could. You've got patience. You've got focus. That's half the battle." Lucas looked up. "And the other half?" "Heart," James said without pause. "And you've got more of that than most grown-ups I know." Later that night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, curled beneath a navy comforter in the guest room James had quickly turned into something close to a child's bedroom, James opened his laptop and reviewed the full file Kane had compiled. It included Emma's old employee records, a photograph of her from the staff directory, some scanned paperwork from the group home, and a preliminary match of DNA based on hospital birth records. The science hadn't delivered a final confirmation yet, but everything else pointed in one clear direction. Lucas wasn't just a child in need. He was James's son. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He wasn't an emotional man, not by nature. He'd learned early in life how to lock up the things that hurt, poverty, loss, longing, and replace them with discipline and drive. But nothing about this felt like business. This was something else entirely. It was intimate. It was terrifying. It was transformative. The next morning, James brought Lucas with him to one of the quieter Harper locations, a rustic, wood-paneled bistro tucked in a corner of the Upper West Side. The kitchen was slow, the staff warm and familiar, and Lucas's eyes lit up the moment they stepped inside. He was introduced as a special guest, and the chefs, without needing any further explanation, treated him like royalty. They let him taste soup, smell spices, and stand on a small milk crate so he could see what was happening on the grill line. James watched him smile, truly smile, for the first time since they'd met. When lunch ended, Lucas turned to James and said something so soft it nearly broke him. "I think I remember this smell. Like home. When I was really little." James didn't speak. He just nodded and rested a hand on Lucas's shoulder. That one sentence carried more truth than James was ready for. Back at the penthouse that evening, James made a decision. He pulled out an old photo album from the closet, a rare possession he hadn't touched in years, and began flipping through pages until he found one of his mother in the tiny apartment kitchen where he grew up. He showed it to Lucas. "She used to say something to me whenever I was scared," James said, pointing to her. "She'd say, 'We don't get to choose where we start, but we do get to choose where we go.'" Lucas stared at the picture. "Did she work in a kitchen too?" "She did," James replied. "She cleaned floors, scrubbed ovens, did whatever it took. And she always believed there was more waiting for us if we kept going." Lucas didn't answer. He just smiled, then turned the page. James sat back and watched him, feeling something loosen in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next deal, or the next expansion, or the next press release. He was thinking about school supplies, bedtime routines, and the miracle of second chances. And somewhere deep in the quiet of that apartment, surrounded by memories and the scent of roasted garlic still lingering from dinner, James Harper began to believe he might actually be capable of being someone's father. Not just on paper, but in the way that mattered most. Every day. Without fail. From this point on, James had always been a man of structure. His life ran on calendars, silent alerts, and the kind of precision that left no room for uncertainty. But since Lucas had entered his world, that structure had begun to bend, first slowly, then completely. He found himself waking up earlier, not to check stock reports or respond to international partners, but to cook scrambled eggs with too much cheese because that's how Lucas liked them. He started leaving work earlier, not because of burnout or appointments, but because Lucas waited for him by the window, sketching plates of imaginary meals in his notebook, hoping they could try cooking one together after dinner. James didn't resent the change. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time his life had felt this full. But everything changed when the knock came on his office door one late afternoon. Mr. Kane entered, his expression unusually tight, a manila folder clutched in his hands. James looked up from reviewing a development proposal and immediately sensed something was wrong. Kane closed the door behind him, walked over, and laid the folder on the desk. "It's the official report," he said quietly. "The DNA test results. It's confirmed, James. He's your son. Biologically. Legally. No doubts." James sat still for a moment, staring at the folder. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Somewhere deep inside, he had known the truth from the first moment Lucas looked up at him with those pale blue eyes. Still, the confirmation hit him harder than expected. There was a weight to it, permanent, undeniable, real. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Was there anything else?" Cain hesitated. "Yes. Child Protective Services is aware of Lucas's presence with you. And because of the circumstances, his escape, the lack of formal custody, you're going to need to act fast. If you don't file for emergency guardianship, they could try to place him back in the system." James's fists clenched slowly on the edge of the desk. The idea of Lucas returning to a group home after everything, after the trust that had started to form between them, after all the quiet meals and bedtime books and nervous little smiles, it was unthinkable. He stood, already reaching for his phone. "Contact legal," he said sharply. "Start the paperwork. I want it filed by morning." That night, when James returned home, Lucas was sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by paper and crayons. He had drawn a restaurant, complete with tables, customers, a kitchen, and a small figure wearing a chef's hat standing in the middle. Lucas looked up and grinned. "This one's called the Little Spoon. I made it for us." James sat down slowly on the couch and picked up the drawing. His chest ached. He looked at the boy, his son, and realized just how much he already loved him. Not in the hesitant, uncertain way of a man facing unfamiliar responsibility, but in the complete, overwhelming way that rewrites your future without asking permission. Lucas had given him something he didn't even know he needed, a reason to live for more than ambition. After dinner, James tucked Lucas into bed and sat beside him while he fell asleep. Then, long after the apartment was silent, James stood at the window, looking out over the city. The lights of the skyline blinked like signals in the dark, but he didn't feel alone. He felt, for the first time in years, like he belonged somewhere, with someone. In the days that followed, the legal process moved forward. James met with a family lawyer, completed background checks, and prepared a formal statement of intent to adopt. He was meticulous in every step, but his motivation wasn't corporate strategy or image management. It was Lucas. It was the thought of him going to school with a name he could say proudly, of waking up in the same bed every morning without wondering if it would be taken away. One evening, while reviewing a stack of forms at the dining table, James felt Lucas tug at his sleeve. "Can I ask you something?" the boy said. James set down his pen. "Anything." Lucas looked nervous. "If I stay here, do I get to call you Dad?" For a long second, James couldn't speak. Then he reached out and pulled Lucas into a hug. "You can call me whatever you want," he whispered. "But Dad sounds perfect." It wasn't just a title. It was a vow. One James intended to keep for the rest of his life. The morning of the court hearing was cold, gray, and strangely quiet. James stood in front of his closet longer than usual, staring at the line of identical suits as if the right one might somehow ease the weight pressing on his chest. He finally chose a simple navy one, less formal than the steel gray armor he typically wore to investor meetings, but still dignified. Today wasn't about image or power. It was about fatherhood. And that made it personal in a way nothing else in his life had ever been. Lucas was already dressed, sitting silently at the kitchen table with a small backpack on his lap. He had packed it himself, though they weren't going anywhere far. James noticed the way the boy fidgeted with the zipper, over and over again, not out of nervousness exactly, but in a quiet, private ritual of control. James poured him a cup of warm milk, then sat across from him. "You okay?" he asked. Lucas nodded without looking up. "Will they make me go back?" he asked softly. James reached across the table, placing a firm but gentle hand over his son's. "Not if I can help it. And I won't stop trying." The courtroom itself was modest, a small family court tucked into a quiet side of the city courthouse. There were no reporters, no cameras, just a few clerks, a tired-looking judge, and the sound of pages turning behind desks. But for James, it felt like the most important room he'd ever stepped into. He sat beside his attorney while Lucas sat just behind them with one of the court-appointed child advocates, a kind woman named Helen who had visited their home 3 times and left each time smiling. Her report, James had read, was glowing. The judge began the session with formalities, reciting case numbers and timelines, reviewing the documentation of Emma Brady's death and Lucas's placement in the state system. James listened closely, every sentence cutting deeper into the realization of how much this boy had been through, how close he had come to being completely lost in the bureaucracy of a system that never even told him who his father was. Then the judge looked up and said, "Mr. Harper, would you like to speak?" James stood, straightening his jacket, but his voice, when it came, was unpolished. "Honest. Your Honor, I didn't know Lucas existed until he walked into my office. I don't know how to explain what that moment meant. But what I can tell you is that from the second he looked me in the eye and asked for a job because he was hungry, I knew my life wasn't mine anymore. I had built restaurants, companies, a name, but nothing I've built compares to the responsibility and privilege of being his father. I don't want to help him out of guilt or obligation. I want to raise him because I love him. Because he's brave, smart, and kind. Because he's my son." There was silence afterward, not heavy but thoughtful. The judge made a few notes, then turned to Lucas and asked gently, "Do you know why you're here today?" Lucas nodded. "So I can stay," he said simply. "With my dad." The judge smiled softly, then leaned back in his chair. "I've read the reports. I've spoken with the advocate. And I see no reason to delay." He paused, then added, "The court recognizes the guardianship of Lucas Brady by James Harper, effective immediately." James didn't exhale until the gavel came down. He turned to Lucas and saw the moment it registered in his eyes, saw the shift from cautious hope to something real, something safe. Lucas didn't run into his arms. He didn't cry. He simply reached out, took James's hand, and held it tight. On the way home, Lucas was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of peace. When they reached the penthouse, James unlocked the door and stepped aside. Lucas entered first, dropped his backpack by the wall, and looked around like he was seeing it for the first time. "Can we paint my room?" he asked suddenly. "Like, blue and yellow?" James smiled. "We can do whatever you want." That night, as James tucked him into bed, Lucas whispered, "You didn't let them take me." James brushed a hand through his hair. "I never will." And for the first time since Lucas had entered his life, James Harper allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten existed, pride not in what he had built, but in who he was becoming. A man not just with a legacy, but with a family. The weeks following the court hearing settled into something that resembled a rhythm neither James nor Lucas had ever really known. It was quiet, but not empty. The mornings began with breakfast at a real kitchen table, something Lucas had never had. Sometimes they made pancakes, other days cereal with sliced fruit, and once, disastrously, omelets that ended with smoke and laughter. Lucas started second grade at a small private school not far from the penthouse, hand-picked by James not for its prestige but for its warmth and the personal attention it offered. James met with the headmaster himself, not as a CEO, but as a father who wanted to make sure his son was seen. Lucas took to it slowly, watching everyone carefully before saying much, but the staff quickly realized he was observant, polite, and quietly brilliant. Every evening, James made it home before dinner. He had never left the office before 7 p.m. in his entire adult life, but now, the moment the clock passed 4, he was already glancing toward the door. He kept a framed photo of Lucas on his desk now, taken during their visit to the bistro kitchen. In it, the boy wore an oversized chef's hat and held a wooden spoon like it was a sword. Everyone who saw it assumed James had a nephew. He didn't correct them unless they asked directly. And when they did, he said it plainly, "He's my son." One afternoon, a week after Lucas's first school project was assigned, he came home carrying a trifold board under one arm and a paper bag full of markers in the other. "It's for Family Day," he explained, setting the board on the kitchen table and pulling out printed photos, drawings, and a crayon-scrawled family tree. "We have to make a project about our family and present it in front of the class." James sat down, already feeling his stomach twist at the word presentation. It wasn't the public speaking. He could give keynote addresses to thousands without blinking. But this was different. This was about belonging, about identity, and James worried what the other children might think when they heard the story of how Lucas ended up in his care. "Do you want me to help?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Lucas shrugged. "I already did most of it. I just need more pictures." James looked at the board. On one side was a printed photo of Emma, slightly faded but smiling. Underneath it was the word "Mom" in neat handwriting. Next to it was a stick figure drawing of Lucas with a big blue arrow pointing to a cutout of James from a magazine interview. Above that, Lucas had written in bold letters, "My family found me." James didn't say anything at first. His throat tightened, and he blinked hard, not wanting Lucas to see the emotion behind his silence. "That's a good title," he said eventually. Lucas nodded. "It's true, right? You didn't know I was there, but once you did, you came to get me. That's what finding means." That night, James pulled out an old photo album he hadn't looked through in a decade. He and Lucas sat on the couch flipping through images of his childhood, of his mother in her apron, of the tiny apartment that had barely held a table and 2 chairs. "She worked in 3 different diners," James said. "Some weeks we had just enough to eat. Some weeks we didn't." Lucas leaned in closer. "Was it scary?" James nodded slowly. "Sometimes. But I always knew she loved me. That made it easier." Lucas was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think my mom would have liked you. She was really good at knowing who the good people were." James couldn't answer. He just placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder and squeezed gently. The following week, on family presentation day, James sat in the small folding chair at the back of the classroom, feeling more nervous than he had at any corporate boardroom. Lucas stood proudly in front of his classmates, showing his project, pointing to the tree, the photos, the words. He told them how his mom used to read him recipes instead of bedtime stories, and how he learned to stir pancake batter when he was 4. He told them that he used to live in a group home, but now he lived in a tall building with big windows and a dad who came home every night. No one laughed. No one teased him. When he finished, the room was quiet, and then a girl with pigtails said, "That's a really cool story." James walked home that day with Lucas's small hand in his. Neither of them spoke until they reached the elevator. Lucas looked up at him and asked, "Did I do good?" James nodded, his voice thick. "You did better than good. You told your truth. And that's braver than anything I've ever done." That night, as they made dinner together, spaghetti with meatballs, Lucas's new favorite, James looked across the counter and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't a temporary chapter in his life. It wasn't a side note or a responsibility to manage. This was it. The life he never knew he needed. The family he never thought he'd have. The kind of love that arrives not with fireworks, but with quiet steadiness and the unwavering belief that no one is too small to change everything. The first true spring weekend came with warm sunlight and the scent of blooming trees drifting through the open windows of James's apartment. Outside, the city was waking up in color again, bright tulips in park beds, families filling playgrounds, and sidewalk cafes spilling over with the kind of soft laughter that only arrived with May. Inside, the penthouse no longer felt like a museum of silence. It had transformed in small but permanent ways. There were shoes by the door that weren't James's, drawings taped to the refrigerator, cereal boxes on the counter, and a well-worn blanket thrown over the back of the couch that Lucas claimed as his own. The space had grown warmer, not because of sunlight or decor, but because it was lived in, loved in, finally inhabited by something real. James stood at the stove, stirring a pot of sauce while Lucas sat at the dining table with a puzzle spread out before him. It had become their Saturday routine, cooking together, music playing low in the background, the day stretching out with no pressure. James had rearranged his work schedule, delegating more than he ever had in his career. For the first time, his calendar didn't lead his life, his son did. As they ate lunch, Lucas looked up with a hint of hesitation in his eyes. "Can we go visit her?" he asked quietly. James knew who he meant. They had spoken about Emma more over the past weeks, sometimes in passing, sometimes in long, late-night conversations when Lucas would whisper questions into the dark. James nodded. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready." That afternoon, they drove in silence to the cemetery where Emma had been buried. James had arranged for a modest gravestone weeks earlier, one with her full name, the years she lived, and a line beneath that simply read, "She gave everything for love." Lucas walked slowly across the grass, holding a small bouquet of daisies they had picked together earlier that morning. He placed them carefully at the base of the stone, then knelt down and whispered something James couldn't hear. James stayed back, giving him space. When Lucas stood again, he didn't cry. He took James's hand and simply said, "She would have liked this." They left the cemetery and stopped at a nearby ice cream shop. Lucas chose strawberry and insisted on sprinkles. They sat on a bench outside, the sun beginning to set behind the buildings. James watched Lucas eat and felt something powerful rise in his chest, not pride exactly, and not relief. It was deeper than that. It was the knowledge that somehow, against all odds, they had both survived the worst parts of their stories and found each other. The days that followed were ordinary in all the best ways. Lucas made new friends at school. James helped him build a model volcano for science class. On weekends, they tested new recipes together, some successful, some disasters. They started calling Sunday mornings Dad and Chef Day, complete with matching aprons. And one quiet Thursday evening, as they sat watching a movie on the couch, Lucas rested his head against James's shoulder and said, "I think this is what home feels like." James didn't answer right away. He reached over and pulled a blanket over them both, then said softly, "It is." The final piece of paperwork arrived in early June. The official adoption certificate. It came in a plain envelope, unceremonious, but it carried the weight of something sacred. James sat at the kitchen table with it in his hands, staring at the line that read, "Lucas James Harper." He felt tears blur his vision and didn't bother to hide them. Lucas walked in from the balcony, barefoot and grinning, holding a paper airplane. "What's that?" he asked. James held the certificate up and smiled. "It's proof," he said, "that we're really a family now." Lucas didn't say anything. He just climbed onto James's lap and hugged him tightly. That night, they framed the certificate and hung it in the hallway near the front door. It wasn't just a document, it was a story, a promise, a second chance. And for James Harper, a man who once thought legacy was built through business and empire, it was the most important thing he had ever earned. As summer rolled in, full of light and possibility, their days blended into something beautifully unremarkable: school mornings, kitchen messes, late-night talks, laughter over burned toast, and the quiet joy of knowing that sometimes, the family you find is the one you were meant to have all along. The ending of this story is powerful in its simplicity. It doesn't rely on dramatic revelations or grand speeches, but rather on the quiet strength of love built day by day. What makes it resonate so deeply is that James doesn't become a hero by saving a child, he becomes whole by allowing himself to be changed by one. Lucas doesn't just gain a father, he redefines what family can look like, not through blood alone, but through commitment, presence, and trust earned over time. This is a story about healing on both sides, of a child who never stopped hoping and a man who didn't know he was missing something until he found it in the form of a boy with blue eyes and too much bravery for his age. It's a reminder that second chances are real, that people can grow beyond who they were, and that love, when chosen over and over again, is enough to rebuild even the most broken pieces of a life. For me, the beauty of this ending isn't in its perfection, it's in its honesty. It tells us that home is not just a place. It's a person. Sometimes, it's the one you least expect.